The watch on my wrist ticked softly. Tick, tock. The hands pointed to 11:45 p.m. I sat on the sofa, facing a stack of red wedding invitations. The golden, double happiness character gleamed harshly under the cold white light. My phone vibrated on the coffee table. A message from my fiancée, Lynn. The wedding dress feels a bit tight, my chest is a little stuffy. Are you asleep yet? I stared at the screen. In my past life, I would have immediately put on my coat, driven halfway across the city to buy her favorite red bean porridge, and soothed her anxious nerves. But now, I just watched. I'm going to sleep. I replied. I turned my phone face down on the table. The calendar on the wall showed the date, April 14, 2023. Tomorrow is our wedding day. On this day in my past life, I was sitting here just like this. Then, at 2 in the morning, I received a call from Lynn's best friend, saying that Lynn was drunk at a bar, and standing beside her was a man named Frank. I stood up and walked to the window. The night outside was pitch black, and the wind hit the glass with a dull, muffled sound. My palms were slightly cold, and my fingertips ached faintly. That was the lingering memory of the steering wheel shattering my finger bones in the car accident from my past life. In that previous life, I was rushing to pick her up when a truck running a red light at an intersection slammed into me. Before I died, I saw Lynn's post on Moments. A blurry photo, with the neon lights of a bar in the background, captioned, "Some people, some things, are ultimately too late." I withdrew my gaze. I turned around, neatly gathered the invitation on the table into the drawer, and locked it. The key turned twice, letting out a crisp click. I didn't go to sleep. I turned on my computer and began drafting a legal statement to renounce the joint home purchase agreement. There would be no wedding tomorrow. 6 in the morning. Light cut a narrow, cold white line across the floor. The door to the dressing room was pushed open. Lynn sat in front of the mirror, her makeup half finished. She looked at me through the reflection, her brows slightly furrowed. "You haven't changed?" Lynn asked. I was still wearing last night's black jacket, the collar slightly creased. "Yeah," I replied. "The groomsmen have all arrived. The wedding car is already downstairs." Lynn turned her head and looked at me. "What's wrong with you? You look terrible." I walked up behind her. Lynn looked beautiful in the mirror, her white wedding dress layered like a frozen cloud. "Lynn." I called her name. "What's wrong?" "The wedding is off." My voice was flat, without any rise or fall. The dressing room fell silent instantly. The makeup artist stopped the brush in hand and took an awkward step back. Lynn thought she had misheard. She let out a laugh. "Chester, that joke isn't funny. The guests are almost here." "I'm not joking." I placed a printed document on the vanity table. "This is the hotel refund slip. Also, I've settled the final payment with the wedding planning company, and I'll cover the losses." Lynn's face gradually turned pale. She clenched the powder puff in her hand, her knuckles turning white from the strain. "Why?" Lynn stared at me. "Because of the message I sent last night? Or because Frank is back?" Hearing that name, I felt nothing inside. In my past life, the name Frank would have made me angry, jealous, and driven me to prove my love like a madman. Only later did I realize that Lynn's resentment was never because Frank was so great, but because I was too good to her, making her feel that kindness was a burden. "No," I said. "Why is that?" Lynn stood up, the hem of her wedding dress rustling against the floor. "There has to be a reason. Chester, you can't be so selfish and make decisions for me." I looked at her and said, "I'm not making decisions for you. I'm just making my own decision." I turned and walked away. "Chester." Lynn called after me, a hint of barely perceptible panic in her voice. "You'll regret this." I didn't stop or look back. The door closed softly behind me. A black sedan was parked at the foot of the office building. I sat in the back seat, holding a financial statement in my hand. In this life, I didn't pour all my savings into Lynn's design studio, which had been running at a loss for years. In my past life, I sold my shares in my own company to cover the studio's debts, only to be forced out by my partner in the end. "Sir, someone from Ms. Lynn's studio came by today to ask when the agreed-upon $500,000 investment will be transferred," the assistant said quietly from the front seat. I turned it down, I said. The assistant asked, what was the reason? No reason. It's a business decision, it just wasn't the right fit. My phone vibrated violently in my pocket. It was Lynn's mother calling. I answered. "Chester. What exactly do you mean? Canceling the wedding just like that, where does that leave our family's face? Lynn is locked in her room now, refusing to eat or drink. You have to come over and give an explanation." The voice on the other end of the phone was sharp and grating. I moved the phone a little farther from my ear. "Auntie," I called out. "The bride price has already been refunded in full. As for the explanation, Lynn knows why." Lynn's mother shouted, "What does she know? Do you have someone else? Let me tell you, this is irresponsible of you. Think whatever you want." I hung up the phone. I watched the street scene receding outside the window. The afternoon sunlight was a bit dazzling, but it carried no warmth on my skin. I arrived at the office of my newly registered company. It was very empty, with only a few desks, chairs, and computers. But this place belonged to me. 8 o'clock in the evening. I was working overtime in the office. The door was pushed open. Lynn stood at the entrance. She changed out of her wedding dress and was wearing a thin gray trench coat. Her hair was a bit messy, her eyes red and swollen, and she was clutching an envelope tightly in her hand. It was an old jade bracelet that belonged to her grandmother, which I had arranged to be returned to her. "Chester, let's talk." Lynn walked in, her voice hoarse. I didn't put down the pen in my hand. "About what? Did you find out?" Lynn walked to the table, her hands pressed against its surface, her body trembling slightly. I looked up. "Find out what?" "That Frank came to see me. That he asked me for money." Lynn bit her lower lip. "I didn't lend it to him. Chester, I swear, I really didn't. I went to the bar last night just to make things clear with him." I looked at her face, full of anxiety and grievance. In my past life, she had explained it the same way. Back then, I believed her, held her to comfort her, and said that as long as she came back, everything would be fine. Later, I found a sentence in her old notebook: "Chester's goodness is like an airtight wall, suffocating me. Frank is my breath." "I know," I said calmly. Lynn was taken aback. "You know." I closed the file. "Yeah. That has nothing to do with me calling off the wedding." Lynn's voice was slightly out of control. "Then why? You weren't like this before. You used to get nervous even when I frowned." I folded my hands on the table and said, "That was then. The door is over there. No need to see you out." Lynn stood still, looking at me before her. She suddenly felt that I was a stranger. This strangeness wasn't coldness, but a complete indifference. She took out the jade bracelet from her pocket and placed it on the table with a clatter. "You don't want this anymore?" Lynn stared at me. "I don't want it," I said. Lynn didn't take the jade bracelet. She turned around and rushed out of the office. I looked at the emerald green bracelet on the table. Under the cold white light, it looked very lonely. I casually tossed it into the trash can beside me. Half a month later, my new project secured its first angel round of funding. The signing ceremony was low-key, with no media present, only a few investors and partners. As I walked out of the hotel lobby, a light drizzle began to fall from the sky. "Chester." A voice came from behind a nearby pillar. It was Frank. Frank wore a slightly pilled jacket, a half-smoked cigarette pinched between his fingers. There was a self-righteous defiance in his eyes. "Let's talk." Frank walked over. I stopped in my tracks. I have nothing to talk about with you. It's about Lynn. Frank exhaled a puff of smoke, which quickly dissipated in the cold air. She's been doing really badly lately. Her studio is about to go under, and she's drinking every day. Chester, this little game of playing hard to get your pulling, is it really that amusing? I looked at Frank. In my past life, this man was a thorn in my heart. Now, looking at him, he's nothing more than a weak man worn down by life, clinging to the obsession of depending on a woman to salvage his dignity. Playing hard to get? I smiled, a faint smile. Isn't it? You deliberately called off the engagement, just to make her bow her head, to make her beg you, right? Now she's had enough. If you really don't want her, I'll take over. Frank stepped closer. I didn't step back. I looked into Frank's eyes, my tone as calm as if I were talking about tomorrow's weather. I said, then go ahead and take over. Frank was stunned. He had prepared a whole bunch of words to provoke me, even ready to throw a punch. But my reaction was like punching a pile of cotton. What did you say? Frank doubted his own ears. I said, I wish you happiness. I turned around and waved at the security guard nearby. This gentleman doesn't have an invitation. Please escort him out. The security guard immediately walked over and blocked Frank. Chester. Stop pretending to be a saint. You'll regret this. Frank shouted curses from behind. I got into the car. The window rolled up, shutting out all the noise. My phone lit up. It was a text from an unknown number. Lynn is in the hospital with acute gastric bleeding. Frank doesn't have the money to cover the medical expenses. I glanced at it, then blocked the number. I closed my eyes. In my past life, also in this hospital, I stayed by her side for 3 days and 3 nights. At that time, my company had an extremely important bid, and because of my absence, the project fell through, and my partner ran off with the money. What did Lynn say when she woke up back then? She said, "Is money more important than me?" I opened my eyes and said to the driver, "Step on it. I still have a client to meet tonight." The car sped off through the curtain of rain. 1 month later. Lynn's design studio was officially liquidated. I came across this news in a small section of the morning financial newspaper. Lynn had no business talent. In my past life, I had to prop her up with money and resources just to barely maintain her reputation as a beautiful designer. Without my support, all the so-called partners withdrew their investments within a week. In the afternoon, I went to the mall to pick out some greenery for my new office. In the atrium of the mall, I ran into Lynn. She had lost a lot of weight and looked terribly pale. She was wearing an old-style dress and carrying a few paper bags filled with odds and ends from her liquidated studio. Frank wasn't by her side. When she saw me, Lynn's footsteps faltered. A glimmer of light flashed in her eyes as she quickly walked over. Chester. I was holding a small potted succulent in my hand, looking at her, and nodded as a greeting. How have you been lately? Lynn's voice was very soft. Pretty good. I saw your new company move to the financial center. Congratulations. Lynn tried to make her tone sound natural, but her fingers gripped the paper bag handles tightly, her knuckles turning white. Thank you. An awkward silence spread between us. The music in the mall was lively, but the space between us felt like a desolate island. Frank is gone. Lynn said suddenly. I didn't speak, just looked at her. He took the last bit of money I had to keep the studio running. He said I owed him, that it was my fault for being with you all these years, that it turned him into a wreck. Lynn let out a self-deprecating laugh, tears welling up in her eyes. Chester, everyone says I'm the one who ruined it, that I threw away a good life. My mom curses me out at home every day. She looked at me, her eyes carrying a desperate, almost pleading hope. She expected me to sigh, reach out, and pat her head like I used to, saying, "It's okay, I've got you." But I just listened calmly. I said, "That's between you and him. It has nothing to do with me." Lynn's tears finally fell. Chester, are you really this heartless? We were together for 5 years. 5 whole years. And now you see me falling into the abyss, and you won't even lend a hand. I placed the succulent plant I was holding back on the shelf. I looked at her. Lynn, the abyss is a path you chose yourself. Didn't you say before that the kindness I gave you was suffocating? Now you're free. You should be happy. I was wrong. I truly understand now. Chester, can we start over? I won't have the wedding. Let's just get the marriage certificate. I'll listen to everything you say. Lynn stepped forward, reaching for my sleeve. I took a step back. My movement was subtle, but the distance between us stretched wide. I said, don't do this. It's not a good look. I turned and walked away. Lynn stood there, her hands suspended in midair. The cold air from the mall's air conditioning blew down from above, chilling to the bone. She watched my back as I walked away. The black leather jacket quickly disappeared into the crowd. She suddenly realized that the old me, who would always turn around to look back at her no matter where or when, was truly gone. 2 months later. My company welcomed its first batch of major clients. At a business cocktail party in the city center, as an up-and-comer in the industry, I became someone many sought to connect with. Halfway through the party, I was on the terrace enjoying the breeze. A familiar colleague walked over with a glass of wine. Chester, young and successful, truly enviable. I heard you called off your engagement a while back. Wise move. Some women these days have too wild a heart, they're not cut out for a settled life. I took a sip of water, just a personality mismatch. That's true. Oh, by the way, a friend mentioned your ex-fiancé to me today. Apparently, Frank went back to her, and they've been fighting every day in their rental place. The police have been called several times. Frank even went to her new company to cause a scene, accusing her of being irresponsible. Now she's lost her job too, pretty rough. The colleague shook his head with a sigh. I stared at the water rippling in my glass. Frank and Lynn. In my past life, I was the villain wedged between them. Frank thought I used money to steal Lynn away, and Lynn thought I used love to trap her. Now that I've stepped out of the picture, only the two of them remain on opposite ends of the scale. Without a common enemy, their resentment can only be hurled at each other. Chester, are you listening? My companion asked. I'm listening, I set down my glass. But that's someone else's life. Just then, my phone buzzed with a message. I opened it to find a photo. In a dimly lit room, Lynn sat on the edge of the bed, a bruise of purple and blue on her arm. Beneath the photo was a line of text, Chester, Frank did this. If you have any conscience left, come to the rental on Wenmore Road by midnight to save me. If you don't come, I'll jump from here. I looked at the text message. Memories from a past life flashed through my mind instantly. Back then, Lynn had also used self-harm to threaten me. Because I found out she had secretly gone to see Frank and argued with her about it. She slashed her wrist with a blade, blood gushing everywhere. I was terrified out of my mind at the time, kneeling on the ground begging her, never daring to mention Frank's name again. Now, the same old trick. I looked up at the time. 11:45 p.m. 15 minutes left until the 12 o'clock she mentioned. I put my phone back in my pocket and walked back into the lively banquet hall. midnight. Beneath an old rental building on Wenhua Road. A torrential rain was pouring from the sky, thunder roaring. A taxi pulled up, and Lynn rushed out. She was completely soaked, her clothes clinging to her body, her hair plastered to her face, looking utterly disheveled. She hadn't jumped from the building. She had been waiting for me. When the clock struck 12 and that number still showed no response, she completely broke down. She knew I had a private apartment here where I often stayed, so she came straight over. She pounded frantically on the first-floor door. Chester. Come out. Chester. The door opened. I stood inside, wearing a clean white shirt. The warm light from the room fell on me, making me seem centuries away from her. Lynn dropped to her knees in an instant, clutching my leg. "Chester, please, save me. Frank is insane, he wants to kill me. He lost money gambling and forced me to borrow from loan sharks. I really can't take it anymore." I didn't help her up. I looked down at her. "Lynn. Get up." "I won't get up. If you don't agree to help me, I'll die right here." Lynn sobbed heart-wrenchingly. I let out a sigh. It was very light, quickly swallowed by the sound of wind and rain. I asked, "Do you think, why did Frank turn out like this?" Lynn froze for a moment, lifting her tear-streaked face. He was always a jerk. I was the one who was blind. "No," I denied her. "In the past life, or rather, before. Every time Frank got into trouble, you would beg me to help him out. He was in debt, and I paid it off. He lost his job, and I found him one through connections. You thought you were helping him, but in reality, you just didn't want to admit that you had chosen a loser. You used my resources to uphold your own devotion." Lynn's face turned paler than a corpse's in an instant. What are you talking about, past life?" I bent down and looked into her eyes. "You've always thought you were the victim in this relationship. Frank hurt you because he changed, I left you because I was heartless. You never considered that all the outcomes were your own choices." I straightened up. "Tonight, I won't call the police, and I won't give you a single cent. Since you chose Frank, then bear the consequences with him." Lynn stared at me, her expression shifting from pain to fear. "Chester, you're not Chester." "Who are you?" I said, "I am Chester. The Chester who no longer pays your way." I pulled my foot out and took a step back. The door slowly closed in front of Lynn. The sound of the security lock clicking shut was especially dull and resolute in the heavy rain of the night. 1 month later. Early summer. My company had completed its series of funding round, with the valuation multiplying several times over. After signing the last contract, I received an unexpected call. It was from Frank. "Chester, I want to see you one last time. At that cafe we used to go to." Frank's voice sounded unusually calm, devoid of the previous madness. I was about to hang up. But Frank added one more sentence. "There are some things about before that I think you should know. About that car accident." I tapped my finger on the table. Half an hour later. The cafe had its blinds drawn, light and shadow crisscrossing on the floor. Frank sat in the corner, a cup of black coffee that had already gone cold in front of him. His beard was cleanly shaven, and he had a hollow look about him, as if after despair. Frank sat down across from me. "Go ahead." Frank looked at me and suddenly smiled. It was a strange smile. "Chester, you think that just because you've been reborn, you have everything under control, right?" My pupils contracted slightly, but my expression remained calm. "What do you mean?" "Actually, I remember too." Frank lowered his voice and leaned forward. "I remember the last life. I remember you being crushed by a truck at that intersection. I also remember Lynn crying her heart out in the hospital." I said nothing, my right hand clenching slightly on the table. "But there's one thing you don't know." A hint of wild exhilaration flickered in Frank's eyes. "In the last life, it wasn't Lynn who posted on moments to deliberately provoke you. She discovered I was following her, and she wanted to run. She sent me a message saying, 'Chester is coming soon, don't pester me.' I grabbed her phone, deleted that text, and replaced it with that photo. It was me who locked her in the bar's private room. It was me who caused your death." I listened quietly. The tips of my fingers were cold, but my heartbeat was steady. "So what?" I asked. Frank froze. He had expected to see shock, anger, even me lunging at him to grab his collar. "You don't hate me. Don't hate Lynn. She really tried to save you back then. Does it matter?" I looked at him. "Frank, that was a past life. In the last life, I already repaid her 5 years of companionship with my life. As for you, that's between you and the law. The day before yesterday, I handed over the evidence of your suspected fraud and intentional harm to Lynn to the police. This afternoon, they should be filing a case. Frank's face changed drastically as he abruptly stood up. Just then, the cafe door swung open. Several police officers walked in and headed straight for Frank. Frank, you are suspected of being involved in a fraud case. Please come with us. As Frank was taken away, he stared at me intently. I remained seated, not moving. So that was the truth. It turned out that Lynn from my past life wasn't as heartless as I had imagined. But I felt no stir in my heart. No regret, no pain, not even a sense of relief. A truth that arrives late is like love that arrives late. It serves no purpose other than adding some redundant plot. I stood up, paid the bill, and walked out of the cafe. The sunlight was beautiful, warm on my skin. But all I felt was a sense of clarity. 3 months later. At the airport. The announcement was broadcasting that boarding had begun for a flight to a certain northern city. I dragged a simple suitcase and stood by the huge floor-to-ceiling window. Outside, rows of planes were about to take off, their silver fuselages gleaming with a cold light under the sun. I was heading out to explore new markets. The phone vibrated in my pocket. It was an anonymous email. Inside was a screenshot of a newspaper's society section. Frank was sentenced to 5 years in prison for fraud and intentional injury. Lynn sold off all her assets to pay off part of his debts, then took her ailing mother and left the city for a small county town that no one knew about. In the social circles of this city, no one had mentioned those two names for a long time. They were like 2 drops of water falling into the ocean, leaving no trace at all. I finished reading the email and deleted it. Emptied the trash. I look up and see my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window. 30 years old, in a neat suit, with clear, sharp eyes. Gone is the weariness of my past life, gone are those heavy obsessions and resentments. I take a ring out of my pocket. It's the engagement ring I was clutching tightly in my hand when I died in a car accident in my previous life. The ring is slightly deformed from the crash, with some wear on the edges. I casually toss it into the trash can beside me. The sound of metal hitting plastic is faint, immediately drowned out by the noisy crowd at the airport. Dragging my suitcase, I head toward the boarding gate. Against the light, my silhouette stretches long. My heart is empty, devoid of any emotion, carrying only an unprecedented sense of lightness. In this life, I am only responsible for one thing, myself.